The gavel was already rising. Judge Eleanor Voss held it 3 inches above the sound block, her wrist steady, her eyes tired. 26 years on the bench had taught her when a case was dying, and this one had been dying for 2 days. In 4 seconds, she would bring the gavel down and speak the words that would end it. Dismissed for insufficient evidence. A man accused of killing his wife would walk out of Cedar Falls County Courthouse a free man, and everyone in that room knew it. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. An 81-year-old woman in a raincoat, soaked from the storm outside, stood in the doorway holding a shoebox against her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Every head turned. The bailiff started toward her, and Judge Voss, gavel still frozen in the air, said the 4 words that would change everything. "Ma'am, this is a courtroom." "I know," the woman said, breathless. "I live next door, and I have something you need to see before you let him go." 9 months earlier, before any of this began, the town of Cedar Falls, Ohio had been quiet the way small towns are quiet, not peaceful, just unwatched. Diane Doyle had lived on Larkspur Lane for 11 years, in a white 2-story house with green shutters and a garden she'd started the spring after her daughter left for college. Her husband, Marcus Doyle, ran an HVAC company 2 towns over. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew the Doyles the way everyone in a small town knows everyone by wave, by nod, by the version of a marriage that gets performed on a front porch. On the night of March 4th, the Doyle house burned to its foundation. Firefighters found no one alive inside. The remains recovered from the kitchen were badly burned, fragmentary, and consistent in size and location with an adult woman. 6 days later, the county medical examiner's office, working with a partial dental fragment and no living relative available yet to authorize a full DNA comparison, closed the identification file, ruling the remains belonged to Diane Doyle, age 47. Cause of death: smoke inhalation, consistent with a fire that investigators believed had started in the kitchen and had not started by accident. Marcus Doyle was arrested 19 days later. The charge: murder in the 2nd degree, with an accompanying charge of arson and insurance fraud, tied to a $2 million life insurance policy Marcus had taken out on his wife 14 months before the fire. By the time the trial began, half the county had already convicted him in their kitchens and diners. The other half swore he couldn't have done it. Marcus Doyle coached Little League, ushered at First Baptist, cried at his own mother's funeral loud enough that people still talked about it. Cedar Falls didn't know what to believe, and for 6 days, the courtroom of Judge Eleanor Voss was the only place trying to find out. Courtroom 3, B-Day 1. The prosecution's table sat David Reyes, 34 years old, an assistant district attorney with a reputation for taking cases nobody else wanted and somehow making juries lean forward. He'd built his career on believing that no one gets away with anything if you're patient enough. This case had cost him 4 months of sleep. Across the aisle sat Grace Whitfield, defense counsel, 61. Silver-streaked hair pulled back so tightly it looked like a decision rather than a hairstyle. She had defended men she believed were guilty and men she believed were innocent, and long ago she'd stopped letting the difference change how hard she worked. Beside her sat Marcus Doyle, in a grey suit that no longer fit him the way it had 4 months earlier. Grief or guilt had taken the same 15 pounds either way. The state calls Detective Raymond Ortiz. Ortiz took the stand the way career detectives do, unhurried, like the room belonged to him. Reyes walked him through the timeline. The 911 call, logged at 11:47 p.m. The fire department's arrival at 11:58. The discovery, 3 days later, of accelerant residue in the kitchen's baseboards, consistent with lighter fluid. And where was the defendant at the time of the fire? Reyes asked. He told us he was in Columbus, business trip, hotel check-in at 6:14 p.m., about 90 minutes before the fire started. Did you verify that? We tried. Ortiz shifted. The hotel's front desk system went down for maintenance that night. No digital check-in record survived. We only had a handwritten note from a desk clerk who no longer works there. A murmur moved through the gallery. Grace Whitfield made a note. Reyes pressed forward before the gap could breathe too long. Detective, did you find anything else of interest in the days following the fire? We did. Ortiz nodded toward the exhibit table. A life insurance policy, $2 million, taken out on Diane Doyle by the defendant 14 months prior. And we found text messages between the defendant and his business partner, Thomas Hargrove, discussing in the defendant's words, needing to make this go away before it gets worse. The gallery reacted before the judge could ask for order. Marcus Doyle's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Grace Whitfield's pen stopped moving. She had seen those texts in discovery. She had an answer for them. But an answer only works if the jury is still listening when you give it. Courtroom 3. B-Day 2. Thomas Hargrove was not supposed to be the state's strongest witness. He was supposed to be a formality Marcus's business partner of 9 years, confirming the strained financial state of Doyle HVAC and Air in the months before the fire. But Reyes had spent 3 private meetings with Hargrove, and something in the man's voice during the last one had made Reyes feel, for the first time in the case, like the ground was solid. Mr. Hargrove, can you describe the financial condition of Doyle HVAC in the months before March 4th? We were drowning. Hargrove's hands sat folded on the rail in front of him, still. Marcus had personally guaranteed a loan that was 2 payments from default. He told me this was maybe 6 weeks before the fire. He told me Diane was the only thing standing between us and losing everything. What did he mean by that? Hargrove looked at Marcus for the first time since taking the stand. Marcus did not look away. He meant the insurance policy, Hargrove said. He said if something happened to her, the business would survive. He said it more than once. The gallery went still in the particular way a room goes still when it believes it has just heard a confession second-hand. Reyes let the silence hold for 4 full seconds, long enough to matter, short enough not to seem staged, then sat down. Your witness, he said to Grace Whitfield. Grace Whitfield stood slowly. She had learned early in her career that speed on cross-examination reads as desperation and stillness reads as control. She approached the witness stand with a single folder. Mr. Hargrove, you and Marcus Doyle have been business partners for 9 years. That's right. And in February, 1 month before the fire, Doyle HVAC's insurance carrier flagged 3 claims filed by your company as, quote, irregular and warranting review. Isn't that correct? Hargrove's folded hands unfolded. I'd have to check the dates. I have them here. Grace held up a single page, did not offer it to him. 2 of those 3 claims were filed by you, Mr. Hargrove, not Marcus. Is that also correct? I don't remember which of us filed which claim. Let me refresh your memory. She set the page on the rail in front of him. And isn't it true that if Doyle HVAC were found to have committed insurance fraud on those business claims, you personally would face criminal liability that disappears entirely if the company's troubles get attributed instead to a grieving, arrested husband? Objection. Reyes was on his feet. Counsel is testifying, not questioning. Sustained. Rephrase. Grace nodded, unbothered. Mr. Hargrove, were you offered anything by anyone in exchange for your testimony today? The question sat in the room like a held breath. Hargrove's eyes moved to the gallery, to the second row, where a man in a navy suit, the company's insurance broker, a man named Denny Fitch, who had sat through every session without saying a word, was watching him very carefully. I want to plead the fifth, Hargrove said quietly. The courtroom erupted into the kind of noise a judge has to fight to bring back down. Judge Voss's gavel came down twice. Order. Order in this courtroom, or I will clear the gallery. When the room settled, Grace Whitfield remained standing, calm, having gotten exactly what 4 months of preparation had been built to produce. She turned to the judge. Your Honour, in light of the witness's response, the defence moves that Mr. Hargrove's earlier testimony be struck in its entirety, as it now appears to have been offered under undisclosed influence, possibly to protect himself from his own criminal exposure. Judge Voss studied Hargrove for a long moment. He would not meet her eyes. The motion is taken under advisement. We'll break for the day. Courtroom 3, B, Day 3. By the third morning, the state's case had a crack running through its foundation, and everyone in the room could feel the building starting to lean. Reyes tried to hold the line. He called the fire marshal, a soft-spoken man named Curtis Ames, who testified that accelerant residue was found, but under Grace's cross, admitted that the same residue pattern was equally consistent with a leaking propane line beneath the stove, a detail the initial report had dismissed in one sentence and never revisited. He called a forensic accountant who walked the jury through Doyle HVAC's debts, but conceded, under cross, that the company's newest contract, signed 1 week before the fire, would have resolved the cash crisis within 90 days, undercutting the idea that Marcus was desperate enough to kill. Piece by piece, the case that had looked unbreakable on day 1 was coming apart in public, in front of a jury that had started the trial certain, and now looked, increasingly, unsettled. Grace Whitfield called Marcus Doyle to the stand on the afternoon of day 3. It was a risk putting a defendant in front of a jury always is. But she had run out of safer options, and grief, if it was real, needed a face. Marcus, where were you the night your wife died? Columbus. His voice cracked on the word, and he pressed his knuckles to his mouth for a moment before continuing. I was at the Riverside Suites. I checked in at 6. I called Diane at 9:30, like I did every night I traveled. She told me she was making tea. She told me to drive safe when I came home the next day. He stopped. That was the last thing my wife ever said to me. Drive safe. Did you set fire to your home, Marcus? No. He looked at the jury, not at Grace. I loved her. Whatever anyone thinks about our marriage, I loved her. Reyes's cross was brief and sharp. You took out a $2 million policy on your wife 14 months before she died in a fire you can't prove you weren't near. I can't prove a negative, Marcus said. I can only tell you the truth. He paused, and for a moment his voice softened, almost pleading with the jury. We had a hunting trip planned for the fall. I was going to teach her to shoot, finally, after all these years. Does that sound like a man planning to lose his wife? That's convenient. Objection, Grace said. Argumentative. Withdrawn. Reyes sat down, and for the first time in the trial, he looked less certain than he sounded. Courtroom 3. B-Day 4. The state rested at 11:15 that morning. Grace Whitfield called 2 character witnesses, Marcus's Little League co-coach and the Doyle's pastor, both of whom described a marriage that looked, from the outside, ordinary and unremarkable, in the way most marriages do. Neither could speak to what happened behind closed doors, and both admitted as much under a gentle cross from Reyes. By the end of day 4, Judge Voss called both attorneys to her chambers. "I'm going to be direct with both of you," she said, removing her glasses. "Mr. Reyes, your key witness invoked the Fifth Amendment on the stand. Your forensic evidence has an alternate, equally plausible explanation, and your financial motive theory took a serious hit when the jury learned about the new contract. I have read your closing outline. I don't think it survives a Rule 29 motion." Reyes's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, the jury should decide." "The jury decides facts, David. I decide whether there are enough facts to send to them. Right now, I'm not convinced there are." She turned to Grace. "I expect you'll be filing that motion first thing tomorrow." "I will, Your Honor." "Then be ready. I intend to rule from the bench." Courtroom 3. B-Day 5, morning. Grace Whitfield's motion for a directed verdict of acquittal took 11 minutes to argue. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. She simply laid the state's case, piece by piece, next to the holes that had opened in it over 4 days, and let the arithmetic speak. Reyes fought for 20 minutes longer than he needed to, because some part of him, the part that had sat across from Diane Doyle's sister in a support group waiting room, the part that had promised her something he had no right to promise, refused to stop fighting on principle, even after the fight was lost. Judge Voss listened to all of it without interruption. Then she folded her hands. "I'll rule after lunch." Courtroom 3. B-Day 5, afternoon. The gallery was fuller after lunch than it had been all week. Word travels fast in a town the size of Cedar Falls, and word was that the case was about to collapse. Diane Doyle's sister, Carol, sat in the front row with her hands pressed together like she was praying, though her eyes were dry and hard, fixed on the back of Marcus's head. Judge Voss took the bench at 1:15. "I've reviewed the record in this case thoroughly," she began, "and I want to say, for the benefit of everyone in this room, that a courtroom is not a place where suspicion becomes truth, simply because it feels satisfying. It is a place where the state must prove its case with evidence, not with the shape of a story." She looked down at her notes. "The forensic evidence in this case is, at best, ambiguous. The financial motive evidence has been substantially undermined, and the state's central witness invoked his right against self-incrimination in a manner that this court can only interpret as casting serious doubt on the reliability of his prior testimony." She exhaled. "Under these circumstances, I do not believe a reasonable jury could find, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant is guilty of the charges against him." Carol Doyle's hand went to her mouth. Marcus closed his eyes. "It is therefore the finding of this court that the defense's motion for a directed verdict of acquittal is—" The gavel rose, and that was the moment the doors at the back of Courtroom 3B slammed open, and Ruth Callahan walked in, soaked to the bone, clutching a shoebox to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Ma'am, this is a courtroom," Judge Voss said, gavel frozen mid-air. "I know," Ruth said. "I live next door, Larkspur Lane, the Blue House. I have something you need to see before you let him go." The bailiff moved toward her. Judge Voss raised a hand, stopping him, not because courtroom procedure allowed for this, but because 26 years on the bench had taught her that sometimes the rules bend for reasons that reveal themselves only in hindsight, and something in this woman's face told her this was one of those times. "I was going to throw this out," Ruth said, voice shaking, holding the shoebox higher. "My grandson was helping me clean the garage last week. Found it behind the water heater where it must have fallen when the shelf broke back in the fall. My old security camera. The battery pack. It still had a memory card in it. I didn't even know the camera still worked. I bought it because of the raccoons getting in my trash. Not for this. I didn't think it recorded anything that night. I told the detective I didn't have any footage, and I believed that, because I forgot the thing existed. Judge Voss set the gavel down. Miss Callahan, do you understand that what's in that box may need to be examined by this court under very specific rules before it can be considered? I understand you might send me to jail for interrupting, Ruth said, and for a moment something almost like a smile crossed her frightened face. But my husband was a fire captain for 31 years before he passed, Your Honor, and I know what I'm looking at on that card. And I couldn't live with myself if I let you finish that sentence you were about to say. The courtroom did not move. Reyes had risen halfway out of his chair, torn between objection and hope. Grace Whitfield's hand rested on Marcus's shoulder, whether to steady him or herself. Even she couldn't have said. Judge Voss looked at the shoebox for a long moment. Ms. Callahan, please give that to the bailiff. Counsel, approach. What followed was not fast. Courts are never fast, even when the whole world is holding its breath. Judge Voss recessed the proceedings for 2 full days to allow the memory card to be forensically authenticated by an independent lab in Columbus, over Reyes's objection that the defense would call it tampering and Grace's objection that the state would call it fabrication. Both attorneys, for the first time in the trial, agreed on something. Neither of them knew what was on it. When the court reconvened, the lab's findings were read into the record. The footage was authentic, unaltered, time-stamped continuously from 7:02 p.m. to 12:14 a.m. on the night of March 4th, recorded on a motion-activated camera mounted on Ruth Callahan's garage, angled by coincidence of geometry, not intention directly at the side door of the Doyle residence. The state would like this evidence entered and played for the court, Reyes said, and for the first time since Hargrove's collapse, there was something steady back in his voice. Grace Whitfield did not object. She had already seen it. Courtroom 3, B-Day 7. The lights dimmed. On the screen mounted beside the jury box, grainy black and white footage began to play, time-stamped 9:41 p.m. The Doyle's side door opened. A figure stepped out into the yard. A woman in a long coat, carrying 2 bags. She paused at the edge of the frame and looked back at the house for 4 long seconds before walking to a car parked half a block down that had not been there an hour earlier, then driving away into the dark. The gallery was dead silent. Your Honor, Reyes said quietly, the state would like to call an emergency witness, Detective Ortiz, to explain what the jury just saw. Ortiz retook the stand, visibly shaken, having watched the footage only that morning. We ran the plate on the vehicle in the footage, he said. It's registered to a rental agency out of Columbus, rented on March 2nd, 2 days before the fire, under the name Diane Marsh. Diane Marsh, Reyes repeated. Diane's maiden name was Marsh, Ortiz said. We pulled hotel records from a Motel 6 in Erie, Pennsylvania. A guest checked in that same night under the name Diane Marsh, paid in cash, no vehicle recorded. Yesterday, at 6 a.m., a woman matching Diane Doyle's description was located at that motel by Pennsylvania state troopers at this court's request. The gallery gasped as one. Carol Doyle's hands flew to her face. Marcus Doyle sat frozen, staring at the screen where the frozen frame of the woman in the coat still glowed, as if trying to make his mind accept what his eyes had already understood. Detective, Reyes said, his voice barely above a whisper now. Is Diane Doyle alive? Yes, Ortiz said. Diane Doyle is alive. The courtroom did not fully recover its order for nearly 10 minutes. When it did, Judge Voss's voice carried the particular weight of someone who had presided over a lie for 7 days without knowing it. I am ordering an immediate recess, she said, and I am directing the state to bring Ms. Doyle before this court, under protective custody, at the earliest possible moment. I want to understand what happened in that house on March 4th, and I want to understand it from her. Courtroom 3. B-Day 8. Diane Doyle entered the courtroom 2 days later, escorted by a victim's advocate and flanked by 2 officers, not as a set of remains identified by a single dental fragment, but as a living woman, thinner than her photographs, her hair cut short, and dyed a color it had never been in 11 years of marriage. She did not look at Marcus. She looked only at the judge. I'm not proud of what I did, Diane said, once sworn in, her voice trembling but clear. I need you to understand that before anything else. Take your time, Judge Voss said gently. 8 months ago, I found threatening messages Marcus had exchanged with a man named Denny Fitch, the insurance broker who handled our policy. Marcus had increased my life insurance to $2 million without telling me. When I confronted him, he told me it was for our security. I didn't believe him. 3 weeks later, I found out he'd asked Denny, quote, what happens if something happens to her before the 2-year contestability period ends? Because insurers can deny a payout if the death looks suspicious within the first 2 years. He was asking how to make my death look like an accident and make it happen after the company could no longer investigate. The courtroom held its breath. Marcus's attorney gripped his arm as he tried to rise. That's not, Your Honor. That's not what those messages said. Mr. Doyle, sit down, Judge Voss said, sharp as a struck bell. You'll have your opportunity? Diane continued, her hands shaking on the rail. I was terrified. I didn't have proof strong enough for police, just fragments, screenshots he could claim were taken out of context. I didn't think anyone would believe a scared housewife over a man everyone in this town loves. So I made a choice I will regret for the rest of my life. I planned to disappear the night he was out of town, and let everyone believe I died in an accidental fire, so I could get far enough away to be safe, and so that eventually the insurance investigation into a suspicious death would expose the truth about the messages he sent Denny Fitch, truth I couldn't prove myself, but that a real investigation might. Did you set the fire, Ms. Doyle? Judge Voss asked directly. Diane's composure finally broke. No. I swear to God, no. I left the propane line under the stove loosened before I left enough that it would leak slowly, and I genuinely thought, it would just be found and fixed, or at worst cause a small kitchen fire that would look like the accident I needed people to believe in. I never meant for the whole house to burn to the ground. I never meant for anyone to die. I found out 3 weeks ago, from my sister, that a man had been sleeping in our detached garage, without our knowledge, a transient man none of us ever met. He must have come inside looking for shelter that night. The medical examiner's office only had a partial dental fragment to work with, and they never ran a full DNA comparison because the case was closed as an accepted identification before anyone thought to question it. I have been living with the fact that a man whose name I still don't know died in that fire believing the world would think it was me. And instead of coming forward the moment I learned that, I let my own husband be tried for a murder that never happened, because I was too afraid of what would happen to me if I stepped forward before I knew he couldn't hurt me anymore. The room was utterly silent. Even the court reporter's hands had gone still over the keys. Ms. Callahan's footage is what stopped me from staying hidden, Diane said quietly. When I heard, from a payphone, that the case might be thrown out, that Marcus might walk free with no record, no consequences, free to say whatever he wanted about what happened to me. I called my sister. I told her everything. She's the one who told Ruth to check that old camera, because she remembered Ruth mentioning it years ago at a block party. Ruth didn't even know what was on it until 3 days ago. None of this was planned. It just happened to be the only piece of truth that was recorded by accident on a raccoon camera by a woman none of you thought mattered. Courtroom 3, B-Day 9, Final Proceedings. The final day of proceedings in State versus Marcus Doyle looked nothing like the trial that had begun 9 days earlier. The murder charge collapsed on its own. There was no victim, and the state formally moved to dismiss it, a motion Judge Voss granted without hesitation. But the case did not end in triumph for Marcus Doyle. Denny Fitch, the insurance broker, was arrested in the courthouse parking lot before he could leave the building on charges of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, after Reyes obtained an emergency warrant based on Diane's testimony and a fresh, court-ordered search of Fitch's business email, which confirmed, in writing, exactly what Diane had described. Marcus Doyle was not convicted of murder because there had been no murder, but he was formally charged that same afternoon with insurance fraud conspiracy and, based on messages recovered from Fitch's server that Diane had never even seen, attempted solicitation of harm against his wife. A chilling exchange in which Marcus had asked Fitch to recommend someone who could make an accident look believable during a hunting trip he had planned with Diane for the following autumn. Grace Whitfield, hearing this evidence read aloud for the first time, did not object. She simply closed her folder and did not open it again. "Mr. Doyle," Judge Voss said, once the new charges were formally entered, "you came into my courtroom 9 days ago as a grieving widower who I very nearly declared innocent of a crime that never occurred. You are leaving it today facing charges far more serious than the ones you arrived with, not because of what happened to your wife, but because of what you intended to happen to her. The law does not convict people for what is in their hearts, but it does convict them for what they put in writing and for what they pay other men to arrange." She turned to Diane, seated now beside her sister in the gallery, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her, still trembling 4 days after stepping back into a world that believed her dead. "Ms. Doyle, this court cannot undo what you did. Deceiving a courtroom, however justified you believed your fear to be, carries its own consequences, and the state will determine separately whether charges related to obstruction are appropriate in your case. But I want to say for the record that I have sat on this bench for 26 years, and I have rarely seen a woman more failed by a system, by a marriage, by every institution that should have protected her before she finally found one person, an 81-year-old neighbor with a broken camera, who refused to let a lie become the official truth." She looked out at the gallery, to the back row, where Ruth Callahan sat in a borrowed cardigan, still holding the shoebox in her lap like she couldn't bring herself to let it go. "Miss Callahan, would you stand, please?" Ruth rose slowly, uncertain, gripping the pew in front of her. "This court does not often get the chance to say this to anyone," Judge Voss said, "but you are the reason justice was done in this room today. Not the detectives, not the attorneys, not me. You. I hope you know that." Ruth's chin trembled. "I just didn't want to throw away the box," she said. "I almost did. It was sitting by my curb for the trash pickup that morning. I don't know why I looked inside one more time." "I think you do," Judge Voss said quietly. "I think some part of you knew exactly why." Outside the courthouse that evening, the rain had finally stopped. Diane Doyle stood on the steps beside her sister, in the first sunlight Cedar Falls had seen in 9 days, not yet free of everything that had happened, but no longer buried under it either. Ruth Callahan walked past her slowly, the empty shoebox now folded flat under her arm, having given everything inside it to the evidence clerk that morning. Diane stopped her. Mrs. Callahan. Ruth turned. You didn't know me, Diane said. Not really. We waved at each other over that fence for 11 years and never once had a real conversation. You had no reason to walk into that courtroom for me. Ruth considered this for a moment, the way people do when a truth needs the right words, and not just any words. I didn't walk in for you, she said gently. I walked in because I couldn't sit at home and let a lie get the last word, no matter whose lie it was. That's not really about you, dear. That's just about what's right. She patted Diane's hand once and walked down the steps toward the crosswalk. An old woman in a borrowed cardigan, carrying nothing now but an empty box, and somewhere behind her, in a courtroom that had almost closed its doors on the truth forever, justice had finally caught up to the story it almost missed.